what is going to happen with the Los Angeles Lakers in this offseason, and how do you feel about this the season going the way that it did?
Well, as far as this season goes, this season was an abject failure from the Lakers' perspective in any way, shape, or form. And I know some of the players, like Anthony Davis, have stated like this year in particular, they were just riddled with injuries, which is true to a certain extent. But it kind of goes without saying that this roster was constructed to go out and win a title. And it was just an abject failure from beginning to end. And this is something that Kevin and I had talked about even before the season had started. We talked about that the Lakers on paper, they looked amazing going into this year. It's just when you look at the roster that they had with guys like Russell Westbrook, Carmelo Anthony, Dwight Howard, LeBron James, Anthony Davis, this is a great squad to roll with. If this was like 2012, Anthony Davis wasn't in the NBA yet, but you take those core guys like Carmelo, Russell, and LeBron. I mean, that's a God squad back in 2012, but it's 2022, and most of these guys, well, let's just face it. LeBron James is probably the only one who's actually still like playing at a consistent level. Carmelo Anthony and Russell Westbrook are pretty much cooked at this point. You could pretty much say the same thing for Dwight Howard. They're just at the end of their respective careers. And it didn't work out in any way, shape, or form. And then when you look at the rest of the roster when it comes to the role players just didn't step up. I mean, you had some guys that had flash moments. Talon had some flash moments earlier in the season, but he wasn't consistent throughout the year. Austin Reeves really didn't start stepping up until probably the second half of the season. Like I mentioned, Dwight Howard had sporadic moments here and there, but nothing consistent. DeAndre Jordan was on this team early on to begin with, but he ended up getting traded. He kind of had a minimal role at best with the Lakers. Trevor Ariza is basically just someone filling a roster spot. He had a little burn to begin with this year. There's some other guys I can mention. Kendrick Nunn didn't even play at all this year. He was on the bench the entire year. He was dealing with his own personal injuries. Just all in all, just the expectation that the Lakers had this season. I think there was good reason to believe that the Lakers would be competitive in the West. I don't know as far to say like they would be like instant title contenders. I didn't necessarily have that perspective, even on paper, even though on paper that they looked pretty decent. I definitely had my doubts. And once this team hit the floor, the amount of inconsistency I saw from this team, it was just staggering. And really, it kind of set home when I actually saw the Lakers play against the Dallas Mavericks about a week and a half ago, where it just doesn't seem like there's any chemistry with this team. And I think by and large, it's just that you have so many different players that are trying to make a name for themselves in their own way. Russell's a ball handler, LeBron James is a ball handler, Carmelo's still going to get decent shots up. He's trying to get as many points as he can. It didn't seem like this team was able to mesh at all this season. And to a certain extent, that was because of injuries. But all in all, it's just a failure. And LeBron James probably deserves the most criticism out of anybody on this roster. I know Russell has been getting a lot of criticism, and it's deserved because let's face it, Russell has been inconsistent as far as his shooting goes the entire year. And I do think that some of the Russell criticism has gone over the top, but in certain instances, I think it's been well warranted. The one person, though, that has gone largely uncriticized was LeBron James. And that's where I'm really putting my major focus is that LeBron was really the one that constructed this roster. I don't want to hear anything about the general manager or the front office really putting this together. Like Rob Pelinka, I understand that he's the GM, but the one who's really wheeling and dealing to get players on the team is LeBron James. And let's face it, LeBron wanted Russell Westbrook over DeMar DeRozan, and look how that's panned out. DeMar's having a pretty solid year in Chicago. Even at one point, he was actually getting MVP considerations because he was on absolute fire during the middle part of the season. And Russell was so inconsistent. I mean, there were times where he was hitting the top of the backboard with his jump shots. I mean, you'd have to kind of go far back into the timeline where you actually see it like a DeMar DeRozan shot actually hit the top of the backboard where it's just an utter brick. And when you look at this roster, they brought in a lot of the old guys that were on this roster when they won the NBA championship just a couple years ago with Dwight Howard, Rajon Rondo. Rondo got traded like within the first third of the season. And Dwight Howard, like I said earlier, had minimal impact with this team. LeBron was really the main focus for the guys that were on this roster, bringing them into the fold. And it was just an utter failure. Now, as far as what's going to happen this offseason, if I'm the Lakers front office, I genuinely start considering trying to trade LeBron James. Because at this point, you're looking at LeBron as maybe having 2 good years left. And then after that, he may start tailing off as far as his production goes. I think it is time for the Lakers to seriously start considering rebooting the whole thing. Because if they go with this roster, or in any way, shape, or form, a roster similar to what they had this year, it's going to end in the same result. And honestly, they might even be worse. Now, if they get rid of Russell, I think that's probably something that they're going to try to do immediately when the offseason hits, because they need to get rid of Russell. And Russell, as far as I'm concerned, he's probably reaching the end of his career as far as a starter goes, because I just don't see how he's going to be that impactful of a player as a starter moving forward. I think his days as a starter are coming to an end. When you look at the rest of this roster, I think you have to start considering looking at AD getting moved as well. Kevin, I'm being honest here. I think you have to really start considering moving major pieces to get something back in return to start a rebuild, because there's no other way to say it. The Lakers are facing a situation where a rebuild is on the horizon, and maybe they just jump started early and get to it now. I'm really considering that as far as what the Lakers are going into this offseason, because this is not sustainable. Granted, I know there were injuries this year, but if I can't rely on LeBron to stay healthy, if I can't rely on Anthony Davis to stay healthy, that essentially kills any sort of chance for them to be viable going into next season. And this year, it really kind of showed that these guys just can't stay healthy, not for an entire season. So I think when it's all said and done, this season is just an outright failure from a Lakers perspective. LeBron James definitely deserves the most criticism out of anybody on this team, even more so than Rob Pelinka. And I think it's time for the Lakers to just completely reboot and start a rebuild, because I think they're just faced with that reality. And that's just how I see it.
I mean, it's really hard to follow up a Laker fan, kind of give his insight and his opinion. I mean, someone as big of a Laker fan as you, who's been watching them since we were kids, I mean, you're going to know the culture better than anybody. You know, you, my brother, and a couple of other my friends that are, genuine full on Laker fans through the Kobe era, the ups, the downs, before LeBron got there, everything. So, really hard to kind of follow up. I will say on the opposite spectrum, to an extent, I will give LeBron a little bit of shit, because I feel that LeBron James did have his hands in the offseason acquisitions to where they kind of leaned into getting Russell over DeMar, as Kyle had mentioned. Magic Johnson recently went on First Take and said that he had heard from multiple sources that they were genuinely looking at acquiring DeMar, because he said that he wanted to come home. But Russell then became available, and they had turned their heads because Russell and LeBron were talking. So again, LeBron James had a very big portion to play in the acquisition of Russell Westbrook, which, in my opinion, ruined the entire chemistry, along with injuries for this team this year. But I have to put it on Jeannie Buss and Rob Pelinka, because at the end of the day, you are the GM and the owner. You make the final say. Whether or not LeBron James has an influence, whether or not he is the megastar of the NBA, whether or not he is the franchise player currently on the roster, you have the right to say, no, I'm not doing that. That doesn't make sense. Why would I do that? You have to be able to evaluate players. You have to evaluate what you would be willing to give up to acquire said players. And you went and you gave up a couple of pieces that maybe weren't scoring at a high enough clip, or maybe weren't contributing at a Russell Westbrook potential level, but they were giving you different pieces and different attributes as a team. So, I mean, in the trade, I believe, what was it, Montrezl Harrell, KCP, and Kyle Kuzma for Russell Westbrook, with a couple of picks included. The Lakers gave up a future. The Lakers gave up young stars. I mean, if you still wanted to trade Kuzma because he was inconsistent, at least you could have gotten something back for him. Instead, you lose 3 players, you lose draft picks, and you don't make the playoffs this year. Neither did Washington. So who really won that trade? I don't really know. The point of the matter is, as a GM, you got to be able to put your foot down and say, this just doesn't seem right. And obviously, DeMar DeRozan would have cost nothing, because they wouldn't have had to give anything up. If anything, they would have had to restructure some contracts. Maybe they would have let some players go because they wouldn't have been able to keep them on the roster. But DeMar DeRozan over Russell Westbrook is an easy choice to me when you already have a ball-dominant player in LeBron James. You have Rajon Rondo coming back. Why do you need to have another ball carrier? Why do you need to add somebody to your roster that can't shoot? Why do you need to add somebody to your roster that is his own on the court and on and off the court diva? Why do you have to add somebody that adds some kind of intensity that may or may not make your team better? I don't know. So the Lakers season is an utter failure. It's an absolute embarrassment. I mean, the Purple and Gold is a legendary organization and franchise between all of sports. I mean, we all know the greats that have passed through that, and to see a roster assimilated to be great and to not even make the play-in tournament when that wasn't even a thing back in the day, to not even basically make a top 10 seed, kind of embarrassing. So I don't necessarily know what's going to happen this offseason. Obviously, Kyle and I don't. It's just pure speculation. I would assume that the Lakers look to move at least Anthony Davis or LeBron or both, just because you've given up your future for multiple players. It's time to start acquiring some picks back. The majority of your roster is over the age of 30, outside of a few players in particular. So I would assume you let those players go. You build up some capital and you see what you can acquire just because of the name that is Los Angeles. Pretty sure a lot of players in the league would love to just play for the Lakers because of the name itself. I know a lot of rebuild situations aren't exactly enticing, but when you talk about the Lakers and then you acquire some draft picks, it could be a landing spot for some free agents. Anything major like a KD, a Steph, obviously not. Probably not. But yeah, I think the Lakers, I agree, Kyle. They need to go into rebuild mode. They need to accept that